Harari Marriage, The Subjugation of Women Through Social Control, by Harari Freethinkers. Sagara hulo a ledgifere, O vegetable of the toilet, sprout of flower. Threads of Memory, Harari Cultural Ceremonies. Volume 1, Wedding Traditions, 2022. Introduction. The concept of a marriage varies across cultures and has changed with time. In the Harari culture, marriage is a celebrated milestone. What constitutes a traditional Harari marriage, expectations, goals, etc., is heavily based on Islamic teachings and practices. In this article, the concepts of both traditional and modern marriages in the Harari society will be examined. More specifically, there will be a focus on how marriages within this culture subjugates women through social control. Elements of an Islamic marriage. Sexual contract. In the Harari community, it is common for an Islamic marriage ceremony to be called nikah. However, originally, the Arabic word nikah does not mean marriage, it means sexual intercourse. Arabs do not use the word nikah to refer to marriage, they use zawaj. The word nikah is used during the marriage contract ceremony because sexual intercourse is what will occur. The fact that the word for sexual intercourse, nikah, is commonly used to mean marriage, in non-Arabic speaking Muslim communities, inadvertently reveals how the act is such a major component of an Islamic marriage. The confusion is documented in the book, Etymological Dictionary of Harari by Wolf Leslau, 1963, where the word nikah is noted as being derived from Arabic and is translated as marriage contract. In an Islamic marriage, the mehr, bride price, is a requirement for the marriage contract agreement. It is provided by the groom and/or his family and given to the bride. The payment is to compensate the bride for consummation of the marriage. An Islamic marriage is thus the contracted sale of a woman's vagina for recreation and reproduction. This is also why there is an emphasis on virginity in Islam. A woman's vagina is considered a commodity. The more useful and clean a vagina is, the more valuable it is for purchase. In the past, it was well understood that nikah was an agreement that permitted the husband sexual access to his wife in return for his commitment to pay. This is illustrated by the following hadith. The Prophet said, "The stipulations most entitled to be abided by are those with which you are given the right to enjoy the women's private parts, i.e., the stipulations of the marriage contract." One could argue an Islamic marriage is nothing but glorified prostitution of one woman to one man. In fact, even the Yaqeen Institute has admitted how prostitution and marriage in Islam are structurally similar because they are both exchanges of sex with money. But an Islamic marriage is not just a sexual contract, it is an unequal sexual contract. This is because a husband has the right to have sex with his wife whenever he desires, because he financially supports her and thus owns her vagina. He can have sex with her whenever he wants and however he wants to because according to Islam, a man's wife is like farmland to him. However, the wife does not have the right to have sex with her husband if he declines. She does not have exclusive ownership of his penis, nor can she access it against his will. A Muslim woman's husband can have sex with up to 4 wives and an unlimited number of concubines, sex slaves. As the subordinate in the relationship, Muslim wives are expected to be obedient and must obey their husbands. As the superior, a husband is not obligated to listen to his wife. This is illustrated by verse 34 of chapter 4, Surat al-Nisa, the women of the Quran. Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend, for maintenance, from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives, from whom you fear arrogance, first, advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and, finally, strike them. But if they obey you, once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand. The verse outlines steps to take if a husband fears disobedience from his wife. The threat of physical violence is a way of forcing women into obedience. In Islam, a wife is nothing more than a legal sexual partner who must obey her husband. Regulated by men. In the Quran, a husband is sometimes referred to as Ba'al. The word Ba'al is Semitic in origin and has been used since antiquity to mean lord or owner. The word was also used to refer to gods such as Canaanite and Phoenician local deities. The Quran even mentions Ba'al as a deity that was worshipped in the past. The word Ba'al also refers to marriage by capture or purchase. It is a patriarchal form of marriage where the husband has control over his wife. The woman is not allowed to get married on her own. She is required to have a male guardian, such as her father or grandfather, to legalize the process. Before and during the life of Islam's prophet, both patriarchal and matriarchal forms of sexual unions existed in Arabia. Islam eliminated matriarchal forms of these unions and denounced them as zina, illegal sexual relations. Only the patriarchal marriage structure of Ba'al was adopted by Islam and became legalized and recognized as the only legitimate form of marriage. The patriarchal structure of marriage is evident in the language of a documented modern Harari marriage ceremony. In a 2016 dissertation written by Abdul Malik Abu Bakr, the following was recorded. The nikah was tied on behalf of Muhammad Berkadleh, a civil servant living in Harur. The nikah was tied on Maria Ahmed. Marriage is thus like a rope that binds women to men. This rope is tied on a woman entirely through the actions of men. Her husband who pursued her, her father or male guardian who is required to consent to and represent the bride in the marriage ceremony, and an imam who performs the ceremony. A woman also cannot untie herself from this bond without men. She can either be divorced if her husband decides to divorce her, or she would have to ask for a divorce through Sharia courts. A divorce would then only be granted if the sheikhs, who are usually men and rarely ever women, allow it. This means, from the beginning to the end of a Muslim woman's marriage, her fate is always ultimately determined by men. In the Harari language, the word for divorce is fataha. This word also means untie, untwist, unload, set free, and absolve. The Arabic word for divorce is talaq, which means freeing or undoing the knot. Similarly, in Sudan during marriage ceremonies, the religious practitioner physically ties a knot in the mosque to symbolize the union. The husband controls the knot and can add more as he marries more women or loosen them when he divorces. This echoes the reality of marriage in Islam, where women are bound to a contract. When a woman is divorced, she is set free from her obligations of obeying her husband and regains ownership of her sexual organs. In the video, The Historical Roots of Female Slavery by Let the Quran Speak, Dr. Shabir Ali describes how an Islamic marriage is simply a contract where a woman must provide sex to her husband. She is not able to refuse sexual advances from her husband. Consent is not required as it is believed to be a husband's right to have sex with his wife. This enables marital rape to occur. A woman must be ready and willing to have sex with her husband whenever he desires. This is the duty of a Muslim wife, and she cannot fulfill her duty to Allah unless she fulfills her sexual duty to her husband. This Islamic fact is reflected in a historical traditional Harari practice, where a husband used to change the location of a stick in his home to indicate he was going to have sex with his wife that night. Specifically, he would move the stick from lying down on a surface to hanging in a designated place near an incense burner. This connection between a stick and sex may stem from southern Arabia before Islam. During this time in polyandry relationships, a man would place a staff before the door to indicate he was having sex with his wife. Furthermore, Dr. Ali explains how the word for divorce in the Quran is talaq, which means release. This further illustrates how an Islamic marriage is a contract where the woman is tied to her husband. This is also very similar to how slaves are bound to their masters. In fact, there is little difference between the rights of a sex slave, concubine, and a wife in Islam. In fact, Dr. Shabir Ali admits that a free woman is not that different from a slave woman in Islam. Consent. The only time a Muslim woman has a say during the marriage process is when she provides consent. However, she can only consent to the marriage if she has hit puberty. If a girl is prepubescent, she can be married without consent by her father or grandfather. However, in Islam, consent is not the same as consent in the 21st century. In Islam, a woman's silence is considered consent. The rationale is that it is, falsely, believed that upon receiving a marriage proposal, some women would remain silent because they are too shy to agree. This element of Sharia law is found in the following hadith. I asked the Prophet, O Allah's Messenger, should the women be asked for their consent to their marriage? He said, yes. I said, a virgin, if asked, feels shy and keeps quiet. He said, her silence means her consent. Of course, a woman can be silent in this situation for many reasons. She may be deaf, mute, confused, shocked, developmentally delayed, or doesn't understand the language. According to this hadith, after not receiving a response from a woman for any of these reasons, a man can conclude that the woman agrees to be married. This is problematic because in Islam, there is no minimum age for marriage. The Prophet Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 and had sex with her when she was 9. Because of this, Muslim men are allowed to marry and have sex with little girls. The lack of verbal and informed consent from a girl or woman means that a marriage can take place without her true, explicit consent. In the context of horror, this reality is even more disturbing considering as recently as the 1920s, the average age of marriage for a girl was just 13 years old. Even 50 years later in the 1970s, a girl was considered ready for marriage when she was still a child of only 15 years of age. At this time, marriage of younger children was reported but was not widespread. This means young girls could be Islamically married without their explicit consent. If such a girl wanted a divorce, she would have to wait until their husband divorces her or seek a formal dissolution of the marriage through the court system. This process of divorce is not guaranteed as she would need to present a valid reason and have it agreed to by the jurists. Therefore, an Islamic marriage can easily trap a girl or woman in a living situation that she is not happy with. In addition, under the Shafi school of thought, which is the traditional school of thought of Harari and other parts of East Africa, fathers and grandfathers are permitted to force virgin girls into marriage without their consent, regardless of whether or not they have reached puberty. In the video, Is Islamic Marriage Unfair to Women? By Let the Quran Speak, Dr. Shabir Ali explains how unfair marriage is to women. He reluctantly admits that an Islamic marriage is not an equal union. There is no minimum age for marriage, and, as mentioned previously, young girls can be married by her father or grandfather without her consent. Dr. Ali also abhorrently defends child marriage by expressing that it was a safe option in honor cultures because the girl and her family will be protected from being shamed if she were to have sex outside of marriage and became pregnant. The rights of wives and children. Muslim apologists frequently say that Islam gave women rights. However, the rights of a wife in Islam are very similar to the rights of a female slave or concubine. Both a free wife and a slave or concubine has the right to food, clothing and shelter from her husband or master. The differences relate to inheritance, legitimacy of children, and ownership of the woman. A wife has the right to a share of inheritance once her husband dies, while slaves and concubines do not. Similarly, only children born within an Islamic marriage are considered legitimate and are thus entitled to a share of inheritance after their father dies. As previously mentioned, a husband in an Islamic marriage owns his wife's sexual organs. A slave owner also owns his slave's sexual organs, but he also owns her entire body because he purchased her. This is why a slave owner can sell his slave to anyone he chooses. However, a husband cannot sell his wife because she is a free person. This is another right of a wife in Islam. The right to not be sold. Islamic reasons for marriage. The Prophet said, a woman is married for 4 things, i.e., her wealth, her family status, her beauty, and her religion. So you should marry the religious woman, otherwise, you will be a losers. According to the hadith above, there are 4 reasons why a woman is married. her beauty, her wealth, her family status, her religiousness. Noticeably absent from this list is marriage for love. However, for much of human history, marriage was never about love. A marriage was an institution between a man and a woman for practical reasons such as increasing a family's labor resources, forming political alliances, and creating trusted social networks. Love as the driving force for marriage is a relatively new phenomenon. Around the 18th century, the idea of marriage for love became the ideal. Therefore, the loveless way Prophet Muhammad thought of marriage was common during his time and continued on for centuries afterwards. Another takeaway from the hadith is that out of the 4 reasons to marry, a woman's religiousness was favored over the other options. A look back at the historical Islamic narrative makes it easy to see why this was the case. When Prophet Muhammad was establishing Islam, his followers were a minority. To gain power and influence, they had to make their numbers grow. Encouraging marriages to women who were also Muslim would result in Muslim children. Automatic new members into the group is a passive way to grow, and a much easier method than active conversion. Today, a major reason why Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world is because Muslim women have more children than non-Muslim women. Having children is not only an easy way to grow the Muslim population, it is also a major reason to seek marriage in Islam. This is demonstrated by the following hadith that indicates a preference for fertile women. A man came to the Prophet and said, "I have found a woman of rank and beauty, but she does not give birth to children. Should I marry her?" He said, "No." He came again to him, but he prohibited him. He came to him 3rd time, and he, the Prophet, said, "Marry women who are loving and very prolific, for I shall outnumber the peoples by you." Muslims commonly assert that Islam highly values women. However, this is not entirely true. Islam only values mothers. Women without children are not given the same social status nor associated with paradise. It makes sense that a religion would put mothers on a pedestal. Less Muslim women having children means less Muslim followers to continue the religion. Without people who believe in an ideology, it will eventually die and become a myth of the past. The association between marriage and childbirth is apparent in the following verse of the Quran. As for women past childbearing, who have no hope of marriage, it is no sin for them if they discard their outer clothing in such a way as not to show adornment. But to refrain is better for them. Allah is hearer, knower. The verse describes how veiling is not required for women who have stopped menstruating. Menopause usually occurs when women are between the ages of 45 and 55. Starting from this age, according to the Quran, women have no hope of marriage. Therefore, from this verse it is clear that the purpose of marriage in Islam is childbirth. This is why younger women or girls are highly valued. They can produce more children. Consequently, this is why older women are not as desirable for marriage. They have less time to produce children or can't produce children at all. As an Islamically influenced culture, the Harari tradition echoes the preference of marriage and children. For example, after the Gufta Mogud part of a traditional Harari wedding, the elderly women sing an expression that can be translated as "we have one." This celebration is thought to refer to the facilitation of the marriage of one's son or daughter. Marriage is considered an achievement or victory of the parents. After one's child is married, the desire now is that they produce their own children. In past generations, large families of 10 or more children were common. Because women must obey their husbands and cannot refuse sex, their bodies can be treated like objects for pleasure and for having as many children as her husband desires. The quantity of people is valued over the quality. In Harari culture, it is common to praise a mother who had multiple children, yet it is not common to ask about the children themselves. The higher the number, the better, regardless of what kind of people the children grew up to become. The problem with this mindset is that, the more children a woman has, the more difficult it is to give each the care, support and attention they need. Is a mother still deserving of praise if she gave birth to multiple children but did not raise them adequately? The evolution of Harari marriages. Marriage by capture? Talafa. As discussed previously, the purpose of marriage historically has been for practical, social reasons. In the past in Ethiopia and many parts of the world, marriage would begin by abduction/capture, also called bride kidnapping. This practice is still common in parts of Ethiopia today. In the Harari language, this form of marriage is called talafa. The following is a description of the events of marriage by capture. A man would abduct a girl and take her away by horseback with his friends. Once they arrive at his home, the abductor would then beat the girl to force her into submission and then rape her. If members of the girl's family or tribe witnessed the abduction, they would chase after the man when he abducted the girl. They would try to get her back and stop the rape, so the rapist would bring some men with him to hold them back. If the girl became pregnant, the abductor could force her to become his wife. It seems likely that this form of marriage was practiced by the ancestors of the Harari people in the past. According to ethnographic studies, at certain points in history, some tribal societies would consider their spouses antagonistic enemies. The joining of the two was mainly for procreation. This way of thinking is in line with marriage by abduction. Because the woman was captured against her will, it is expected that she will act antagonistically towards the man to regain her freedom. In order to subdue her, the abductor beats her with a whip to weaken her body and frighten her into submission. The main reason the man abducted her was so she could produce him a child. In this method of marriage, the man forces a girl or woman to become his wife. The girl or woman has no say in the matter. It is an abusive relationship where the woman is not a wife but a victim to her abuser and rapist. Even if the girl or woman does seem to love her husband, this is not love. This is a psychological response called Stockholm Syndrome. The bond between a woman and man does not stem from mutual love and affection. Instead, it stems from dependency and psychological abuse. The woman loses her sense of self and begins to see her husband's happiness as her own. Arranged marriages. In more recent times, marriages were arranged by the families of the bride and groom. The two families would meet to discuss the fate of their children, ultimately making a decision based on their own desires. When people who lived in the same neighborhood gathered, they would discuss possible arrangements of marriages. Alternatively, sometimes the boy or man would find a girl first and then tell his family. While not as traumatic as talafa, the obedience of a wife to her husband continued to play a central role in the relationship. In Harar's history, marriages between political figures were sometimes arranged for strategic purposes. For example, Harari Emir Ali B. Dawood's son, Abdullah, had at least 5 of his sons with women from 5 different Oromo tribes. This was done in an effort to strengthen ties with neighboring tribes to protect Harar from invasion. Modern love marriages. In the present day, Harari men and women in the diaspora are largely in control of who, or if, they marry. These marriages are driven by various individual desires such as love, intimacy, and companionship. They choose the person they wish to commit to and build their lives together. Now, instead of marriages being based on a wife's obedience to her husband, mutual respect and love is the foundation. In line with contemporary changes in the perception of marriage, this union is now commonly viewed as a partnership instead of an ownership. It is thought that the increase in girls' education and exposure to different cultures may have brought about this change. However, because the Harari population is largely Muslim, the Islamic ideal of a patriarchal marriage can affect modern marriages to varying degrees depending on the couple. It must be noted that because the marriage of one's child is viewed as a goal for many Harari parents, it is possible that forced/coerced/pressured marriages still occur in the Harari community despite the increase in the freedom of girls and women. However, the frequency of such events is unknown because it is not publicly discussed. The choice to marry. Muslim women are thought to have the choice to marry or not. However, this is not a free choice. It is an illusion of choice. This is because, historically, the subordinate and exploitative nature of a traditional Islamic marriage makes it an undesirable institution for women. Therefore, in order for a woman to want to enter such an unequal relationship, she must be compelled. In Islam, women are compelled to marry because it is the only legal means for them to experience sex. It is also the only legal way to gain the social status of a mother and have children. Because Islam associates mothers with paradise, entering a marriage is the only legal way to potentially reach this ultimate goal of a Muslim's life. Recent associations between marriage and love present an additional reason why Muslim women are compelled to marry. In order to experience romantic love and emotional intimacy with a man, Islamically, it can only occur within a marriage. If a Muslim woman wants to receive and give love, she must also enter the sexual contract of an Islamic marriage where she is subordinate to her husband and must comply with all his desires. The decision to not marry upon receipt of a proposal would mean to forego all the aforementioned social and religious benefits gained with marriage. This is an unlikely choice for a devout Muslim woman. However, if it weren't for these exclusive benefits that Islam locks into marriage, Muslim women would have a true free choice. The social status and life of Harari wives. You know what to expect from me, as you have seen my character of a good wife. Suppose I tell you now, what I, in my turn, expect, and how you may best please me and make me happy. Margaret Davenport Coulter, 1795. Before the recent emphasis on mutual love and companionship in marriage, these unions in Harari followed the Islamic tradition that focused on the wife's obedience to her husband. The patriarchy and misogyny that stems from the religiously mandated subordinate position of wives is illustrated in various aspects of traditional Harari culture. One is the traditional Harari practice mentioned previously, where a husband used to change the location of a stick in his home to indicate he was going to have sex with his wife that night. A Harari husband was in charge of when sex between the couple would occur without regard to the wife's sexual needs. Islamically, a wife cannot refuse sex from her husband because ownership of her sex organs is what a man receives in return for his financial support. Misogyny in Harari culture is found in the Harari language, where the wife's side of the family is called the side of the foot, while the husband's side of the family is called the side of the head. The wife and her family are thought of as subordinate to the husband and his. She is expected to obey him and not publicly act against his wishes. In Islam, husbands are allowed to beat their wives if she does not comply with his desires, or even if he fears she might not do what he wants. The life of a traditional Harari wife was difficult. Because of Islam's patriarchal marriage structure, much of her quality of life depended on her husband. The Islamically sanctioned physical abuse meant she was always at risk of, or was experiencing, domestic abuse. The Islamically sanctioned expectation of unrestricted sex meant marital rape was not considered immoral nor a crime. These women suffered by not being in control of if and when their husband touches them. Children were born from wives who did not consent to sex, because their consent is not Islamically required. These women were forced to carry, give birth to, and then raise children they didn't plan to have nor were ready to have. If a woman wanted to leave her husband, she faced barriers by having to navigate the Islamic court system and risked social stigma and shame. The social stigma is found in examining the Harari language. For example, the term Armela Waldi means a child who does not have a good upbringing because they were raised by a divorcee. This reflects the belief that a two-parent household is essential to properly raising a child. In the Harari culture, like many other Islamically influenced cultures, women are encouraged to stay within marriages and not seek divorce unless absolutely necessary, if at all. This mentality is dangerous because it forces women to prolong their suffering in marriages where they are unhappy and/or are facing abuse. This could not only lead to prolonged suffering but also the death of these women if the abuse escalates. The murder of women by their spouse or family member is a leading cause of death of women worldwide. Therefore, it's clear to see how Islam and the Harari culture has negatively affected Harari wives psychologically, emotionally, and physically. A Harari wife lived at the mercy of her husband. If he was abusive, Islam allowed him to use his discretion to abuse her. If he decides to not be abusive, only then could a Harari wife live peacefully. To make matters worse, a wife who was abused could not object to her ill treatment publicly because such treatment is considered Islamic and is thus equated to fairness. However, one way Harari women have been able to express how they truly felt was through their songs. One example is from a song that is traditionally sung during the Gufta Mogad hair ceremony of a Harari wedding. Sagara hulo a ledgifere. O vegetable of the toilet, sprout a flower. Threads of Memory, Harari Cultural Ceremonies. Volume 1, Wedding Traditions, 2022. This quote, which is also presented at the beginning of this article, according to a modern interpretation may refer to the idea that while one's environment may make it difficult to flourish, something beautiful can still grow from it. The interpretation relates this to the bride as a message of hope in case she ever finds herself in an unpleasant situation. However, this modern perspective fails to take into consideration the reality of a traditional Harari marriage before the recent concept of love and mutual respect. Traditionally, Harari marriages were focused on the Islamic foundation of marriage, obedience of a wife to her husband. Using this historically accurate perspective, one can arrive at a different interpretation of the verse. In the past, a Harari bride would have had many reasons to think of marriage as unpleasant. For one, she would have had to transition from being the child in a family to being the wife of a man she barely knew. The average age of a Harari bride in the 1920s was only 13 years old. The young girl would now have many responsibilities to her new husband. This included obeying him, being intimate, bearing children, and taking care of the home. Many young brides were likely not thrilled at this sudden change in lifestyle. They couldn't play and have fun anymore. Their childhood was over. Their life would now be focused on serving a man. If the Harari girl was the victim of a forced marriage, or talafa, she had even more reason to be unhappy with her future. Any girl or woman would be upset if they were forced to live with and obey a man who abducted and raped her. Therefore, using this understanding of the historical context, one can see how the verse can refer to the present situation of the bride, not a hypothetical future one. The verse is sung by the elderly women in an attempt to comfort the bride about the harsh reality of her new life ahead. This perspective is further supported by the structure of the song. All of the verses that precede the verse, Sagara hulo a ledgifere, directly speak to the bride and describes her. One verse refers to her as Surroy, which means secret, and says her speech is pure like milk. Another verse again speaks to her directly and describes her beauty. The verse, Sagara hulo a ledgifere, can thus be assumed to follow this established structure of the song. The bride is called Sagara hulo, vegetable of the toilet. The sagara, toilet, represents the unpleasantness of the marriage the bride is starting. The elders are thus wishing the bride flourishes and blossoms like a flower despite the unpleasant reality of her new status as a wife. The elders were once in the place of the young bride, so this verse can be interpreted as their way of expressing hope for the future of women to rise despite the difficult life they are forced to live. The verse shows how Harari women viewed married life, quite understandably, in a negative way. Their clever use of metaphor allowed the women to express their true feelings within the patriarchal community without being detected and objected. This suggestion that the Harari women attempted to pass on a message of hope to future Harari brides is supported by history. When the Harari people were conquered by the Christian Ethiopian Empire, they faced political oppression and were not able to teach Islam, Harari culture, or history. In order to preserve the Harari identity, Harari women would conceal messages through cultural songs. Girls would learn these songs in female-only social institutions called moigar. Conclusion. From the beginning to the end of a traditional Harari marriage, a wife is subjugated by the treatment prescribed in Islam, her husband and her community. She is robbed of her agency, control and dignity. The Islamic patriarchal marriage structure enabled Harari women to face abuse, discrimination, and unimaginable suffering. The bond is essentially a sexual contract where the woman must obey her husband in a manner akin to a slave obeying her master. The Islamic scripture codifies the abusive conditions in Harari marriages, forcing wives to live at the mercy of their husbands. Historically, a traditional Harari marriage has changed over time. In the past, degrading marriages left Harari women suffering with few options to improve their lives. Despite the hurdles, the Harari women held on to hope for a better future. Today, Harari marriages have changed from what they were in the past. This is because Harari women are more educated than ever and secular concepts of marriage are common. Harari women have more agency and choice than ever before. They also have more power and freedom to define the romantic and sexual relationships they have. However, despite this change, the unspoken patriarchal ideals of an Islamic marriage continue to play a role. For example, it will always be preferred, if not required, that a Muslim Harari wife listens to her husband. For Harari Muslim women, Islam's gatekeeping of religious and social benefits within marriage will continue to restrict their life choices.